Okay, thanks, Jess. This is Ambrose Little, and I will be taking you through this today. I am the Director of Product Management here at Infragistics, Product Development. And I've been with Infragistics for about 8 or 9 years, and I've done lots of different things while I'm here. Before that, I was primarily a web developer and architect. I wrote a few books on ADO.NET and ASP.NET and Silverlight and Microsoft MVP and those kind of related things. So as Jess said, what we're talking about today is the kind of the next level down from what the other two webinars were covering, which is kind of thinking about desktop to web migration in terms of the architecture that you have to look at. And what we'll cover today is, first of all, a little bit of detail around what we mean when we talk about web or modern web specifically, and then look at a few different options that we have, and then we'll wrap up and answer some questions. So there's my contact info if you want to connect on LinkedIn or send me an email. So let me tell you a story about Bob. Now, for those of you who don't know, Bob was a skeuomorphic interface for Windows way back in the day. As you can see the date there, but actually no, that's not the Bob that I'm talking about. That one didn't work out, and so we're just not going to talk about it. What we're talking about is this Bob, which this Bob is a Jedi master. He knows his UI stack and his full stack development backwards and forwards. He's the guy that people go to, and he's written so many apps that he can't count them anymore. And Bob has a boss. In case you don't know, this is the boss from this hilarious comedy called Office Space. I highly recommend it. And this boss comes to Bob and he says, I'm going to need you to move to the modern web. That would be great. Okay. And Bob's like, oh my goodness, his head explodes because he's sitting here going, you know what? I have all this experience in desktop development, and now you're asking me to move to this new technology stack, and I've heard a lot of bad stuff about it. It's a pain in the butt and all that kind of stuff. So he's thinking, I must unlearn what I have learned. The reality is not quite that. But before we get into that, let me go ahead and do a quick poll so we can get a sense of where most of the attendees are coming from. And if you could just answer this poll, what your current UI development stack is, that will help me to maybe focus a little bit on what I talk about. And we'll leave that open for a few seconds while people respond. Okay, so we've got about 65 or 70%. That's probably going to be enough, and I'll go ahead and close that out and see if I can share it briefly with you. And as you can see, I think you've got 45% Windows Forms, about 20% WPF Silverlight WinUI, 17 Web Forms, 12% ASP.NET MVC. So that's kind of what I would expect in a webinar that's talking about, going from desktop to web. So I have one more poll real quick that I wanted to run by you, and it's, what is your level of familiarity with Ignite UI? So if everyone could just quickly chime in there, that'd be helpful. Wow, people were able to vote on this one faster. All right, so we're up to about 75 or 80%, which is plenty good. And I'll go ahead and close that out and share it. As you can see, the huge vast majority hasn't had a really good chance to look at it yet, so that's fine. We're going to talk about what Ignite UI is and how it can help you out today. So back to our story. So Bob is sitting here and he's been asked, he's a very experienced desktop developer, and he's been asked to move to the modern web. And he's thinking, oh my goodness, what am I going to do here? The reality is that you don't exactly have to unlearn everything. Obviously, there are a lot of differences, but your core development skills are still portable. All the useful and wonderful design patterns that you learn, how you architect your code and all that, all those best practices still apply just like they would, and you know they would. If you're going to choose to use .NET on the server side using, say, ASP.NET MVC or something like that, then you can leverage all those C# skills and a lot of the core, business library kind of stuff. And then, of course, debugging is an art, and if you've become an experienced developer, all of that, transfers over. You'll have to learn, different things you're debugging, but all the skills of finding where problems are apply. And then you'll be able to use your data, of course, and the data and services layers. And what we're talking about here in terms of how you access data. Now, if you're doing like directly using ADO.NET to connect to, say, a SQL server, that's going to have to change. But if you've already got a services layer, maybe it's in WPF or something like that, or maybe you're using stored procedures and things like that, you can put layers on top of that, especially if you use something like Entity Framework. It can easily help you to expose your data in a web-friendly way so that you can leverage it in these kinds of applications. And then, even though a lot of your stuff might port over, it's a good time to rethink and reassess the application UX itself. A lot of desktop applications have developed over the course of decades, and they've learned from their original inception, and they've built on top of them all these little pieces that kind of get added on. So it's a good chance to kind of rethink that, maybe get some user research going, and specifically thinking about what it means to be touch enabled. And then there's the phone scenarios as well that you're going to have to think about in relation to all this. Rethinking your application UX, which ones make sense, which ones don't. You don't have to move everything, and I'm pretty sure that Kevin covered a lot of that in his prior webinar. So, but what is the modern web? You hear that term a lot, and of course it's the things you see here. It's HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. That's web in general, but specifically, if you see the moniker modern, most of the time people are thinking it's HTML5, it's CSS3 or above, it's JavaScript, and usually it's, in terms of standards, ECMAScript is the standard, and it's version 5 or above for that. So interestingly, 5 and 5 for JavaScript aligned, but of course CSS is 3. But the point here is not so much the numbers, it's more about it's kind of like being current and what's currently being developed, because the way that web standards have developed has actually changed over the years, and they're much more responsive, and they're driven by practical development with the different browser vendors. And so, there's a lot more effort being put into them than there was for about 5 or 6 years there in the 2000s. So why are you moving to the modern web? Of course, the modern web is, from a user perspective, it's devices. It's their phones, it's their tablets, all of those different things. And it's also, of course, still about laptops and desktops. But the point is that the main driver to move to something like the web versus the desktop technology is going to be the broader reach that you can get. Another key aspect when people talk about modern web and it's related to the devices is responsiveness, and that's there's a few different aspects of this. The core concept behind it, of course, is you have your application being accessed on potentially lots of different form factors, different devices, maybe have touch, maybe they don't, maybe they use mouse, whatever. And you need your application to be able to support all of those and respond to all of those. There's a particular technique called responsive web design, which uses media queries and CSS to adapt the structure and some of the sizing and things like that based on device attributes. So the core one is usually the screen width and height, but you can use media queries on other things like DPI and stuff like that. And then the adaptiveness part I mentioned here because there's also the option, and some people, depending on the nature of your app, you might want to do some server-side based adaptiveness. So that's going above and beyond what you can do on the client side in CSS, and you might actually serve up different views or different navigation or something from the server itself. So you have to think about these things when you're going to the modern web, because again, it's about all these different devices. And then with that touch, Is it touch first? Is it touch ready, touch friendly? Touch first, that's kind of like whether or not you go one of these routes depends on what you know about your users and what they're going to be using as kind of like a primary interface. So if you know your application is used in a scenario where people will be having tablets most of the time, then you would probably want to take a touch first kind of approach, which is where you prioritize in the design itself touch interactions. Touch ready is kind of like the other end of the spectrum, which is, it'll work on a touch device, but it's not like going to be particularly nice. It just won't totally fail or be unusable. And then kind of middle ground is touch friendly, which is it pretty much works either way equally well, and you're at least ready and able to use it effectively with touch and other input devices. So that's kind of like the user and the the human side of it, if you will. From the technology side, what people usually mean is modern browsers, and I will define that, I promise. You've got often JavaScript application frameworks, and all this stuff we're gonna get into in a little bit more detail. And then you have REST-like web services, usually with JSON as the data format. So REST is representational state transfer. It's a simplified kind of way of representing your data services. Usually it's noun-based, or they call them resources, so you would expose things like your customers and so on. And then you would use actual HTTP verbs, like get, put, delete, etc., to access those resources. And it's only REST-like because there's a core aspect in REST called hate OAS or HATEOAS, or however you want to pronounce it, but it's hypertext as the engine of application state. And that essentially lets your server, if you will, determine like what happens next in your flow. This is actually the web itself. That's the core idea behind how the web works, is that particular approach. Most applications, from a user experience point of view, don't do well, being driven entirely from the hypertext point of view. So that's why it's only REST-like. But anyways, JSON is JavaScript object notation. You've probably heard of that, but it is definitely the de facto standard in terms of your data format when you're transferring data on these kinds of applications. So you're going to want to get familiar with that for sure. What's really great about it is that JavaScript can essentially take that and hydrate it into objects that you can work with in a way that you're familiar with, at least in terms of using standard dot notation and accessing stuff. So it's pretty handy that way. It's also very compact, so you send less stuff over the wire than you do with things like XML. So that's kind of like a high-level overview. Now we're going to start talking about browsers and what we mean by that. So it wasn't long ago people were still saying, and maybe some people still are saying, we only use IE6. Well, IE6 is officially dead, has been for some time. You can see there's a little URL down there, modern.ie. Highly recommend that as a site to get familiar with and stay on top of the developments that Microsoft does with regards to their browsers. If you go there today, you'll actually see stuff about their new Edge browser. I'll touch on that a little bit, but the full URL is IE6 countdown. It actually shows you based on real usage how, in the world at least, not necessarily internal apps, how this is being used. But it's like 1% worldwide. China is the oddball at like 3% the last time I looked. So this is more what we talk about when we say modern web browsers. And we've got obviously Chrome, Firefox, those are the biggies in addition to Internet Explorer. And then Safari, primarily because of all the Apple devices, but Macs are becoming somewhat more common as well in the enterprise these days. And then, of course, all of the flavors of these on your mobile devices. And the key kind of break in thinking that we have to make is we no longer have like control over the kind of the runtime environment. We can't specify that it's .NET whatever or WinForms whatever. It's standards-based development, and that's why it's very important that you work with your IS guys. Make sure that these one or more of these browsers are available to your users on on the desktops, and of course they don't really even have options on some of the mobile devices of what browsers they use. So it's not feasible or viable at all to think I can lock down and tell people, what browser they're going to use and control that. Instead, we have to think about how we can be more adaptive. And what's interesting here is that the thing that you lose if you do try to say, I'm going to lock down to a browser like IE 10 or whatever on the desktop, it just doesn't help you, because then you've still got to support these other browsers because you've got other devices that you can't put IE 10 or whatever version you want on there. So really it's a shift in mindset, and you get to save some effort, because if you do try to lock into earlier versions of IE, it causes you all kinds of headaches when you're trying to also deal with these other modern browsers. So that's the key shift there. In terms of Chrome and Firefox, those are what we call evergreen browsers, so they update themselves by default. That sounds a little crazy probably in the enterprise environment, but in general, it's kind of the way of the web, and it's the way even Microsoft's going with their new Edge browser. And again, if you're programming towards standards, then you save the time that you would lose by trying to adapt to all these different browsers by just programming against the standard. And that time that you save can then be used, responding to potential problems that occur. So, it's a trade-off, and there's no single right way. IE 11 itself does have an enterprise mode where, especially if you have older web applications, you can kind of lock those into particular versions. You can see here, even if you have apps that are running in IE 8, getting your desktops onto IE 11 will give you huge performance gains, and it also gives you the flexibility for your new apps to be targeting more modern web kind of standards. So in general, that's the way to go. Another key shift is, we'll see here, we're moving away from browser detection. So anyone who did web development before, maybe even a little bit of it, it wasn't unusual to say, if IE 6 or something like that, do all this code, otherwise do all this code. And that's out. Sometimes it's still necessary, but most of the time what you want to opt for is feature detection. And that's where this can I use can also come in handy, because if you go to caniuse.com, you can actually type in there a particular CSS3 or HTML5 or whatever feature that you want to use, and it will actually give you the current state of the different browsers and versions and how well they support them. And that gives you at least some sense of the support. And then you can go to the next level, which is using polyfills, and that's taking these libraries that essentially emulate the standards functionality on older versions of browsers. So it's a good way to kind of get the best of both worlds. It's not, nothing's 100%, but it gets you a lot of the way there. So another common objection or concern that Bob has, and he's heard this a lot, is that JavaScript is total junk. It's a crap language, and nobody who really cares about code would actually write in it. And the reality is, it's maybe not good, but it's not as bad as you've heard. It's relatively well performing. In the recent years, the browser vendors have been hugely investing in JavaScript performance, and there's no end in sight with that. They're also looking at changing evolving the language itself so that they can actually do more optimizations and making it more well-performing. So a lot, or most, probably line of business enterprise apps should be able to do fine with JavaScript. If you've got some really high-performance code, you might have to look at other options, but that's something you have to kind of figure out for yourself. And the language itself, while kind of loosey-goosey in a lot of ways, if you pick an idiom and you go with it, like different ways that you can do object-oriented design and programming and modularity and things like that, they're all very well publicized, very well known patterns, the module pattern in particular, in terms of helping to make JavaScript, even as it is today, more maintainable and less error prone. And the other aspect is if you use things like, say, CoffeeScript or not JavaScript, TypeScript, there's these, some people call them transpilers, compilers, whatever the actual technical term is, but they actually give you a layer on top of JavaScript itself that helps you to write in a more structured way. And TypeScript as you may or may not know, is Microsoft's kind of answer in that space. And they're all kind of thinking about the future in terms of the next versions of JavaScript. So then you've also got lots of libraries. So jQuery has been around for a long time, almost a decade, I think now. And its original purpose was to kind of abstract away all of these inconsistencies in the browsers when it comes to, accessing the DOM and manipulating stuff. So it's still a very popular library. A lot of the browsers have taken the things that jQuery did and made them native in the browser themselves. And the interesting thing is that jQuery has adapted to that, so where it can, it will also use the native function, so it can use, again, get the performance gains where it can, but it still provides a pretty good and useful abstraction layer that can make you much more productive. And of course, Ignite UI and many other things are built on top of jQuery. The future is promising. I've already mentioned the evergreen browsers. They're constantly working on this, and then you can see here this little picture from the URL down there. Kangax is a pretty well-known guy in the modern web space, and he maintains this tables out there where you can see specifically for the different type, the different features of ES6, ES7, and so on, how well the browsers support them. And then on the left there, you can see compilers and polyfills, so you can get a sense of how well those are hitting the standards as well. Some things you just really can't do with a polyfill, so it's just a matter of waiting until the browsers support them. Interesting thing to note on this is that of the Microsoft browsers, you see IE10, IE11, and Edge. Edge is like basically the #1 browser for ES6 support. So Microsoft has totally turned the tables in terms of hitting standards and performance and things like that, and that's kind of their direction in terms of browsers as well. So all of this is crazy. It's different. It's like the Wild West, but you got to keep calm and yeehaw on. That's my policy, and highly recommend just riding the wave and kind of adapting to it. But there's definitely things that you can do to help you tame the beast. First of all, I'll just talk about the basic web architectural constraints. The fundamental thing is you are in the browser, and you see here the core aspects that you would be concerned with are, of course, the DOM, that's Document Object Model, and that's HTML, primarily HTML and CSS, and then you can manipulate it using JavaScript through whatever the JavaScript runtime is in the browser, and that's fully sandboxed. So if you're used to using ADO.NET to directly access SQL Server, ain't gonna happen. That's where this comes into play. You use HTTP-based communication with your web services and servers, So obviously they'll send down the standard web stuff, HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, but once you have that loaded, it's not uncommon to use the XML HTTP request object and fire off asynchronous requests to get more data, maybe even some structured HTML that you want to add to your application and to make it more dynamic. So that's the core object in the browser that lets you have those communications. And there are controls. You can't call out typically to other domains. So you have to learn, about the sandbox and what that means in terms of what you can do for communications. You may have to use like a proxy web server in order to get access to other resources, and that's where these other objects come into play. Whatever your web server is, you'll call through that, and it will access your database. As mentioned earlier, that's the reusable chunk for sure that you'll have there. Maybe you have other web app or even cloud servers. Maybe you're looking at using Azure or something like that. You can, of course, do pass-on calls like that if you need to. Ultimately, it all comes back through that same channel. So this is a fundamental shift in the sense of how you get the data and how you communicate with other resources. So the two roads diverged in Yellowwood. That's a Robert Frost poem. Isn't this a beautiful picture? I kind of just want to sit here and relax for a little bit. But the reason I have it is to illustrate essentially two core pretty good options that you have when you're thinking about your web application architecture coming from a desktop environment. So the first one is what's commonly known as single page applications, and the abbreviation for that is SPA, like it or not. That's what it is. And the essential thing to know here is that it provides you a clean separation between client and server. It's actually more like probably what desktop developers are used to in terms of having kind of an encapsulated rich client with all the UI gunk there, and then it just accesses data services to do things. And you'll see that in this diagram here. So I blew out the client browser here to kind of give you some sense of what it would look like if you took this approach. And this is all very hyper generalized, so depending on the framework you use and how you design the stuff in your client browser app, these pieces will be different, some may be missing, and so on. But I've tried to, illustrate some of the pretty common things. There's a common term called MV star. So for these application frameworks, they all have some flavor of model, views, and then either models, view models, etc., depending on how you look at it and whatever application architecture pattern you pick. So pieces, view templates, that's going to be the reusable pieces of HTML. Then you've got data binding, which helps you to essentially use those templates and plug in data. Should be familiar, especially to WPF developers. But even for Windows Forms, obviously, there's some concept like that in there. And then the view or view models, again, depending on the architecture you choose, that has the objects themselves that you use in your data binding and passing information back and forth with your servers. And then some of them have, the typical MVC, which is view controllers, and those have the client-side logic that kind of helps coordinate all the stuff that's going on there and passing, accessing your services and, sending stuff to your views and things like that. And a lot of these have routing and navigation pieces. So, you can get those kind of friendly URLs showing up in the browser. Maybe if it's pure client side, then you'll see like the little hashtag mark and some moniker. That's how it will, know kind of what page it's on and what state it has. Maybe if you're using HTML5, which probably you will be, there's a new standard that's pretty well implemented that actually lets you use more normal looking URLs so that you can kind of give those out and they don't seem so weird and funky. And then lastly in this box is the communications layer, and that's again usually most libraries, even jQuery, have an abstraction layer on top of the actual XML HTTP request object, and that's just to make it easier because there are some still a few differences there, but also there's lots of different variables, and it just makes it a little bit easier to use. So whatever framework you choose, they tend to have some sort of combination of these, and it's all in the browser. It's all very responsive. It feels like almost like a rich app, from a desktop app. It's not like the full page refresh kind of model that you've probably seen a lot on the web, and it uses services to communicate with your servers on the back end. Now, you can see here, if you take this model, you can use pretty much any web server you want, .NET, ASP.NET, MVC, Web API. You can use Node.js. That's a new, well, it's not really new anymore, but it's a JavaScript-based runtime that is commonly used for servers, and then of course Java and so on. So common SPA application frameworks, sorry that was a little redundant, common SPA frameworks. AngularJS, that's by Google. Backbone.js has been around the longest for sure of these, but probably just in general. It's not quite as full-fledged in terms of most of these other options, and it has lost some momentum in recent years as people shift to some of these other options that are more full-featured. Ember is also a good choice if you're thinking something more traditional, rich client. It has kind of more of those patterns that are built into it that are more familiar perhaps. And then React is Facebook's option. It's not, again, it's not a full-fledged library, but a lot of people really like it. It's very performant, and it's a good option for if you're not going to go whole hog into an application framework. And the last one on here is Aurelia. That is Rob Eisenberg's newest endeavor. He's the guy who also did Durandal, which was by far the most popular framework for JavaScript for Microsoft developers. For whatever reason, I think it's because he has the relationship with the ASP.NET folks already. So the reason I'm listing it there is like it's pretty brand new compared to all these. It first was launched at the beginning of this year, but it's very promising. It's very forward-looking, and he does have relationships with a lot of people, in the web industry. So something to keep an eye on and consider. But at the end of the day, right now, pretty much the best choice, from my perspective and a lot of other people's, is Angular from Google, and that's partly because it's backed by Google, so that gives it a lot of momentum. But also just the adoption in the market has been huge in the last few years, and it's not a standard per se, but if you're looking like, please solve this problem for me because there's a bajillion options, this one's a pretty safe bet to go with. So then we get into Ignite UI and how Ignite UI fits into this whole picture. You can see here Ignite UI is built on top of jQuery UI. jQuery UI is you can think of it as sort of a framework for encapsulating UI components. So they call them widgets, but it's essentially the same thing as a control. And it provides a standard interface, and it's been pretty popular and still is pretty popular, which is why we decided to go with it. Modernizer isn't exactly required, but it does provide some nice ways to help you do detection and adapt, and we use it for some of our touch stuff. So those are kind of our dependencies, and of course jQuery is required as well. In terms of how it fits into that application picture, it fits in at the as you would expect, at the UI layer, at the view layer, but it also kind of goes through some of the other layers when it comes to the data access stuff. So you can definitely use it with pretty much all of those options, and we provide some special support for Angular and for Knockout, which I didn't mention. Knockout is just a data binding piece of the puzzle, but we support that as well. So most of you said you hadn't really looked at or had a chance to look at Ignite UI, so I'll go ahead and touch on that a little bit to kind of give you a better sense of what it is, and then we'll move on. So I'm just going to launch this little URL here, and hopefully it will open up. Yay. And you see this is our application samples page, and the reason I kind of mentioned this first is you can go in here and get a good sense of some of the really inspiring and awesome and beautiful ways that you can use Ignite UI, so you can really get some high quality, good feeling apps. And the most recent one we did was this marketing dashboard. So all of these, you can kind of launch them and get a sense of how they look and what they behave like, and get a feel for what you can do. So those are there for inspiration, but in terms of what Ignite UI is specifically, and I'll just go ahead and hit the home page for that, it's what you would expect if you're familiar with us. In the past, a lot of the core stuff we do, we've got your grid, we've got your tree grid, which was recently added, we've got the hierarchical grid, we've got pivots. Data chart is the fastest, most capable charting option for the web, and then lots of other charting options and data visualization options. We've got some things to help with layout, of course combo box, other editors, some frameworks. We just added the JavaScript Excel framework, so you can actually manipulate Excel documents in the browser and easily, for instance, export your grids to Excel without having to go to the server. And then these other documents and templating engines and things like that. So anyways, I'm not going to go over all of them, but you get a sense just by looking at this list briefly that it's kind of what you would expect from Infragistics if you're familiar with us. And we definitely have you covered for the core line of business enterprise app stuff with grids and data charts and combo boxes and things like that. If you come here, you can easily explore all the different samples that we have just by clicking on those and so on. So I'll leave you to do that. I just wanted to give you a brief introduction and kind of cover what Ignite UI is. Whoops, that's not the right option. That's the one. So how does this kind of come together? Well, this is kind of giving you a rich SPA architecture as a suggested approach. You can see here in the browser we've got Angular. and that gives you a lot of these pieces. It's got the templates, the data binding, the controllers, the routing and navigation. And then we've got Ignite UI, which kind of plays in this space in terms of making your apps rich, because what you get out of the box is just standard HTML stuff, and if you tried to build a grid yourself, good luck, you're going to have a lot of effort with that. So that's where we play, and then I highly recommend this library called Breeze.js, and it facilitates communications with your web server, and it actually will help you build your client-side object models for your actual domain models, so that you can easily then bind those to your either Ignite UI or whatever other templates and that you have going on there. This URL, you don't have to memorize it. You can probably just search Breeze Angular template or something like that with ASP.NET. You'll get to it, but I mention it because it kind of goes into more depth on this architecture. It doesn't specifically mention Ignite UI, but you can easily figure that part out. And of course, in terms of communications, it's all using JSON. And on the website or the web server side, if you took this kind of recommended approach, especially if you're coming from a .NET background, then ASP.NET Web API is kind of your best option. It's super easy to use compared to a lot of the server frameworks for making web APIs, and it has all of the baked-in stuff for talking to your SQL servers and things like that. Entity Framework, you're probably familiar with that. You can use it with your rich client apps using desktop technologies as well. So if you do already have that, then you can easily expose that as OData services on the web. And you don't have to, though, just noting that that's kind of probably the easiest approach. So that's kind of what I would suggest if you're brand new to this and you want someone to kind of help focus, because there are so many options out there. This is a pretty solid option, and going forward, Microsoft's 100% behind MVC and Web API. They're doing all this work with Azure and making sure it can run even on Linux and even on other options like that. So it's definitely the way of the future, and it's got Microsoft support behind it, so I recommend it. So that's kind of like the one side of one of those roads or paths that you saw. Another path is more, even though Web API is technically part of ASP.NET MVC, what I'm talking about here is the traditional MVC web application, which is a modern server-side web application framework. It differs from web forms primarily in that web forms tried to emulate the Windows Forms model. So you had your view, and then you had the code behind that you can manipulate the view, and it was all sort of monolithic to get together. And it was good in its day, and it was very effective for what it did, but it didn't really fit the web model or the way the web works, and so it caused a lot of problems, especially when you're looking for distributed applications at scale. So essentially what MVC does is get you closer to the web paradigm of application architecture, which is, in this case, it's model view controller, but the point is that, you don't have so much state being maintained and sent back and forth, and that the views are kind of more related to the routes that you pick. So I'm not going to go into a lot of depth with that here, because honestly, trying to cover that is more than one presentation on its own, but I did want to give you a high-level overview. You can see here, this is more or less, I found this on the web. I've got a link to where it is in a later slide, but you have your view request, and that's based on a URL, and then you've got a routing engine that determines, okay, based on that route or the URL, what controller should take it. The controller then hands it over to the controller, and the controller is the thing that's responsible for taking the view in your model and kind of giving you the output, which is you have multiple options for view engines. You have the ASPX option, but the more popular one is Razor. Ignite UI works with both. And the other piece of the API requests is the API request, and that's what you were seeing earlier, which is the Web API. So again, it comes in through the same engine essentially, and it just chooses, an API controller, and then it will use media type formatters to respond with JSON. And it does a lot of the heavy lifting for you in terms of translating your C# objects to JSON, which can then be consumed on the client side. So how does Ignite UI fit into that? Well, we fit in as you would expect if you're familiar with this framework, but I'll just kind of give you a little flavor of it by opening up this sample. You can see it's using our grid, and pretty much all of Ignite UI, in fact, I would say all of it, I can't think of anything that doesn't, has what we call MVC helpers or wrappers, and basically that gives you a server-side interface to our client-side component. So it's still the same Ignite UI. It's still super, responsive and works well in the client side. But what we're doing here is providing you with a server-side, essentially object model that you can use to interact with it. And you can see here, if you're familiar at all with ASP.MVC, you'll see some familiar stuff here. And then this is a common approach with ASP.NET MVC. It's called method chaining, and that's how you kind of set up all the different options that you want on the grid, and you can even use C# to kind of tell it how you want to format things, and then you can do sorting and so on. So pretty much all of the grid features you can do with the server-side ASP.NET MVC stuff. It's going to be obviously remote, so from a user point of view, you're not getting the full page refresh, but it is calling back to the server, and then the server kind of sends back the stuff. And it's not necessarily the cleanest architecture from a pure kind of architecture point of view, but if you're really wanting to avoid learning JavaScript, which I think anyone who's going this path really should invest in learning that. But in the meantime, maybe if you need kind of a middle ground, it's a good option so that you don't have to write so much JavaScript and you can rely more on your C# skills. But again, I would definitely suggest that people be thinking about moving more to the other model that I was showing you, which is the SPA model. So the funny thing is that SPA and MVC can be best friends. And for those who don't know, that's Ren and Stimpy. It's kind of a crazy cartoon from my youth, but that's how I feel about it. Here's kind of what that looks like, and I give you the little link to look in more depth down there. But it's AngularJS with ASP.NET MVC using web APIs. So it's kind of blending the two architectures. And the thing that they're particularly saying here is you can set up your Angular app as like a master page, and then you can have the MVC using partial views supply the particular different views based on the routing. So it's an interesting architecture. I'm not necessarily recommending it, but it's something to look at if you want kind of like a blended architecture. But the other thing to note here is that you can also have, within the context of a full-fledged application, you might think of them as like little mini applications. So you don't have to stick literally your entire huge desktop application into one HTML page and try to load it all into that, because that might not work out so well from a manageability and from a performance point of view. But if you can find like natural divisions, whether it's based on products versus accounts and things like that, then for each one of those, you could sort of have like a route with your ASP.NET MVC that would serve up its own full-fledged SPA application. And then, of course, you're using the data services. So that's probably the best approach from my perspective in terms of how you architect if you have a larger application, to sort of break it up that way. And but you can also look at this approach. It's an interesting approach. And I just wanted to note a little bit on the future, what things are going to be looking like. JavaScript and all the stuff is definitely evolving, and it will continue to evolve and improve. There's so much momentum in the industry around this. And, it's hard because, there's lots of devices and lots of browsers, but it's kind of the only option, really, if you want to have the broadest reach. And, we just kind of have to adapt to it. But some new important standards that you want to look at and keep an eye on, we certainly are web components. And that's technically not a standard, but it's kind of like an umbrella for these other standards, which are Shadow, Document Object Model, Custom Elements, and HTML imports. Shadow DOM is a way to kind of hide some of the details. So if you think it's basically about encapsulation. So, as for instance, Infragistics, we could provide a web component, and a lot of the inside gunk that you don't even need to know about is hidden from you. Whereas today, it's sort of hidden, but it's in JavaScript that gets loaded into your app directly, and we dynamically create a lot of HTML and so forth. But this provides a much cleaner encapsulation. capsulization model. And custom elements, that's if you're familiar with WPF and other things like that. You can supply literally, your HTML can have a grid or something like that rather than like a div, which is standard HTML. And it maps to your web components that way. And you can see some of this if you use Angular today with their directives. So they're kind of like doing a polyfill for that, and you can get an experience of what it's like. And we do have Ignite UI directives, so if you're using Angular, I suggest and recommend looking at those. They make it friendlier and easier because then, like I said, you can do grid, and you can configure the options using kind of non-standard tags, and it's a kind of a more natural way to deal with this stuff than writing a bunch of JavaScript. And the last piece of this particular umbrella is the imports, and that's mainly a way so that you can break up your code in a more modular way and have it be loaded into the browser in a modular way. So all three of those together, they kind of form this overarching web component standard, and it's definitely the way of the future. A lot of the newer ones like Aurelia and Angular 2, which is in development, they're looking more towards these standards as well. So definitely keep an eye on that stuff. And CSS grid layout is another important one because layout on the web can be something of a difficulty, especially if you're coming from something like WPF or even Windows Forms where layout is kind of a non-issue. You have to really think about it with the web. It's just the way it is right now, but grid layout is going to give you that more familiar kind of two-dimensional grid approach. So keep an eye on that one, and we will too. So Bob, at this point, I hope you're feeling it's also clear, at least from an architecture point of view, and what modern web is. It's all these things: devices, modern browsers, standards, JavaScript frameworks. He knows that there's 2 or 3, depending on how you look at it, good choices for modern web architecture. You can do the web client and the API server, which again I recommend. You can do the ASP.NET MVC approach, and you can do a blended approach, and no matter which one of these you picked, Ignite UI can definitely help you out with that. And Infragistics definitely wants to partner with you. If you feel like you need help, this is just scratching the surface. There's a ton of other stuff you have to get into, and if you're coming at it from being especially a desktop web developer, it's a mountain to climb, and we want to help you with that. And we've got UX experts who can help you with reassessing and improving your experience of your apps. We've got modern web dev experts who are far more expert at this stuff than I am, and they can help you train you and your colleagues or your developers and help you design your apps, something like what we were talking about today. And of course, from a product point of view, Indigo Studio helps you design, and you can ship it with Ignite UI. And I wanted to do a little shout out. We've got a white paper we're going to be publishing here in another couple weeks, I think. I think everyone who's subscribed should get some sort of notification about it, but we'll be publishing it on our homepage and sending it out in one of the email blasts. And it goes into more depth in terms of thinking about the analysis, like where you are today versus where we need to get in order to effectively make this shift from desktop to web. So I suggest checking that one out. And that's pretty much it for this talk. And now we can go ahead and open it up for questions.
All right, so thank you, Ambrose. What we're going to do is we're going to open up our questions panel where we can, if you want to, we can actually drag that little, yeah, you can pop that on out there. And so Ambrose and Jason are, as they take a little peek at the questions that have been submitted and see what they can find. I just want to let everybody know again that you will be getting a recording of this presentation if you registered. We're going to be sending out a follow-up that has this recording as well as a link to all the other recordings as well. So if you want to make sure to keep an eye out for that, we'll be able to send that out to you. And I guess now I will send it back over to Ambrose and Jason. Now they've had a chance to look at the questions, and they'll start to address some of the more interesting ones that they've found here.
Okay, so one of the questions is, do you have guidelines on UX changes that should be considered? We do have some guidelines. I actually have a talk about moving to, especially focusing on like touch devices and mobile devices from standard desktop devices, and that's on YouTube, on our YouTube channel. And we'll be publishing more content there. And then, like I mentioned, we can definitely help you out if you want to reach out to us and point you into the right direction. Services stack, please touch on it. I did touch on it. I didn't go into a lot of detail, but my suggestion there is, especially if you've got existing SQL servers and things like that, that you take a look at Entity Framework as a way to more easily expose your data over what they call OData. So it's a good way to kind of put those resources into web APIs and be able to consume them in applications like this. And I have a question. What if it's unrealistic to go to IE10 or better? In large corporations, we have multiple dependencies that keep us on obsolete browsers. Is there anything we can do? Well, I mean, Ignite UI specifically, we support currently IE8 and above. So from that perspective, it's, we got your back. But, in general, as I said earlier, I would recommend like having this conversation. I know like probably some people are not in a position to have that conversation, but if you can try to work towards that, in order to really hit all of these devices, it's not realistic to lock everyone down. Now, that said, IE10, I mean, if you really are just going to only desktops that have only IE10, you can definitely do that. IE10 has decent support, or even IE9 has somewhat okay support for HTML5, I mean, modern web stuff. But you're going to have to rely more on polyfills for those things if you really are stuck with those. And that's kind of solution. Or, if you really literally are locked in, then fine. Don't even worry about these other ones and just code for IE8 or whatever it is. So if you're going from Windows Forms to web, what is available to allow the old applications and newly developed one to operate against the same SQL database? What I would suggest there is, I mean, there's definitely the option to look towards something like Entity Framework, but if it really kind of depends. So if you've got a lot of stored procedures, then you can expose those stored procedures as service endpoints on using Web API, and it will, again, do some of the heavy lifting in terms of transforming the data for you. But you definitely can't like have them both talking at the ADO.NET level, but you could have them both talking at the service level. So you could change your Windows Forms apps to use whatever services level layer that you put on top of there. So I'd like to know what you think about ISAPI applications. I don't think much about them, honestly. My understanding years ago is they're kind of a little bit lower level, and I would kind of recommend looking at a higher level framework at this point, whether it's ASP.NET or something else like that. I'm not familiar with the UNI GUI framework, but I will check it out. Ronnie, if you want to reach out to me, I can look into that with you. And is there a masking tool or editor? Yes, we do have masking editors in Ignite UI. Would you address the big data result set? Could it be compressed and aggregated server-side and sent to the client? We have a lot of customers who use rather large data sets, and there's a couple approaches with that. I mean, you are going to be limited by the browser architecture itself and what it can handle, so I would recommend against kind of stuffing like huge data into the browser, but it can handle a decent amount of data. If you're going to stick big chunks into the browser, for instance, our grid has virtualization, so it helps you to see it quickly and fluidly in the grid. But really what I recommend for that situation is really to chunk it out, and you have to think about paging primarily when you're talking about the grid. For the chart, we also have, it's built in, so you can give it a big set of data, and it will go ahead and do coalescing on the data points when you're zoomed out, and then you can zoom in and see more data, so it kind of handles all those details for you as well. If you want to know more on that, feel free to reach out to me, and I can connect you with the information on that. Does the data binding have a formatting layer to handle things like globalization? Yeah, I actually forgot to mention it, even though I thought about it, was internationalization. There are some good libraries out there for that, and if you want, you can email me, Ambrose at Infragistics.com, and I'll hook you up with that. So I will, hand you the information on that. But there are some out there. It's not really standardized yet. And I got a comment. Everyone loves log. That's a Ren and Stimpy illusion. Thank you, Fred. I love log too. How could jQuery be able to get? Wait, how could jQuery? Basically, how does it work with offline? I think is what the question is. There's actually a standard for dealing with that, and Craig Shoemaker recently published some content on having applications that kind of do okay when they get disconnected. You can store things in local storage. There's the web. The browser has its own kind of local databases, and then you can sync that back up when you get connected. So there's some options there for dealing with those situations. And how can we convert jQuery type of library back to JavaScript to work offline? I'm not sure I understand the question. Let's see, convert jQuery. So jQuery will run in the browser 100%. So if the browser gets disconnected and is offline, it will still totally work. The only thing that won't work is the communication back to the server. So you wouldn't have to do anything really to get that to work offline. I hope I'm understanding the question. So for the charting controls, how many data points is reasonable, and what's the upper rate, so on. So Mark, it's essentially our same data chart that we have in WPF and recently released in Windows Forms. So all of that logic about coalescing the data points applies in the browser. The only challenge there is going to be the payload of getting that data down to the browser and how well the browser can handle it. So that's kind of your constricting factor there. And I think 1,000 points, no problem, absolutely no problem. Now, if you get into the hundreds of thousands or millions of points, that's where just the sheer volume of data might become a problem. How can we get sample application for AngularJS? I would definitely look at if you go to Ignite UI, there should be a link to our Angular stuff there, or if you're not finding it for some reason, you can reach out to me, and I'll get you hooked up with the Angular samples that we have for AngularJS. But in Angular in general, there's tons and tons of samples out there because it is a highly adopted framework. How can a mean stack developer leverage Ignite UI? And that's MongoDB, Express, Angular, and Node. You should be able to totally leverage Ignite UI. It lives in the UI layer, so we have the Angular directives, so you can use it directly that way. And then from a services point of view, as long as you're using something like REST API services, or even not REST, if you want to do the formatting yourself, you could call back to a Node web server and it's no problem. Links and books for beginners. Again, if you want to reach out to me, I can share some of that with you. What do I think about Bootstrap? Actually, it's the best option, I would say, currently for a CSS framework. And for those of you who don't know, CSS frameworks are a way to provide some structure and simplicity around styling applications and making them more responsive. So Bootstrap is probably, and I'm not even saying probably, it definitely is the most popular one of those out there. Another good option is Foundation, but if you want to kind of go with the flow, Bootstrap's a good choice. And Ignite UI specifically has both some built-in or free Bootstrap themes, as well as the ability to take a Bootstrap definition and generate an Ignite UI theme based on it. So if you go to our igniteui.com, you can see under theming that where the Bootstrap stuff is there. And I can take my question back. Sorry, someone took their question back. Hang on a second. How would large data sets be presented in the browser? For instance, 200,000 or more items. I think I touched on that, but basically I would highly suggest you do paging, server-side paging with that, and then feed that into your grid, I'm assuming in this case, or maybe it's a chart, I'm not sure. Is there any video on how to actually start using? Yes, there are. In fact, I would recommend going to igniteui.com. You can also go to our infragistics.com and find the jQuery product there, which is Ignite UI, and we've got links to videos that are out there and on our YouTube channel. Okay. Are browsers practical for representing large data sets? Same kind of caveats apply. It depends on how large, and I would just recommend your testing with some of your data, throwing it into a chart. I mean, I think the chart's going to be the harder one because with something like the grid, you can do the server-side paging, so it's more manageable. Is Ignite UI included in Infragistics Professional? Yes, it is. Guide to using JavaScript idiomatically. There's a few good books out there. One is by John Ressig, who is the creator of jQuery, and I would suggest that you check that one out. It's called, I think, something JavaScript Ninja, but if you just search JavaScript Ninja, that will get you there. And then there's a few other books about, how to kind of the gotchas, and if you want specifics, my brain is kind of failing me on the actual names, but just email me, Ambrose at Infragistics, and I'll happily get those to you. We do have a data chart sample Jason is showing me that shows, how many is that?
1 million.
1 million data points, which refreshes in 860 milliseconds. So that's our data chart, and you can see it definitely supports pretty high volume data. So check that one out. It's on our Ignite UI browser. What are browser standards? ES6 and ES7, sorry. That's ECMAScript. That's the official standard term for JavaScript. And so ES6 is the next version, and it's largely supported. It's actually going to be formalized and released this summer, as I recall. And ES7 is the next one. It's in early development, but it's interesting if you want to kind of follow the development there. And is there support for remembering users, control, config across sessions? Yes, storing that in a database is one way to do it. And the other way, if you can rely on them to be using the same browser, is there's local storage in the HTML5 spec for the browser. So that's another option, although I would generally recommend doing that on the server side. Ignite UI runs on smartphones. Yes, it runs on smartphones. We also have, which I didn't really go over, jQuery mobile controls that we fully support, and those are in there as well. Could we develop a standard line of business application with all the stuff? Yes, we have some pieces of that in some of those app samples I showed you, but I'll take this as a note, but also, Carl, if you want to email me with more specifics, we definitely are always looking for ideas on good samples that will help people get going quickly. Currently using 3D charts. Will there be any support for that? There's no current plans. If we do 3D support, honestly, from a user's point of view, there are limited numbers or types of chart that really benefit from 3D, like the area scatter chart, for instance. So that's kind of the way we would look at it, is like which ones actually benefit from 3D and how could we do that. But we're not currently working on that. Do you publish AngularJS demo? Yes, I mentioned that earlier. Thank you. Does Ignite UI play with Bootstrap? Yep. And do you provide directives to fit? Yep, I mentioned that. For Angular, we do have directives. And do you have an opinion about Knockout.js? I very briefly mentioned that, but we do have support for Knockout if you're using it. I do have an opinion about it. It's a fine data binding framework, but it only gives you that piece of it is the data binding aspect. So I would kind of suggest that if you're starting fresh, that you would maybe look more at the Angular option. What does your design tool, I assume talking about Indigo, what does it spit out and how is it useful? So the primary purpose of Indigo is to help people to explore designs quickly and find the best designs possible. It's a prototyping, code-free, that sort of thing. However, we do currently have I think it's either released or still in beta, but there's a way to get some JavaScript and HTML and CSS out of your prototypes and start sort of jump starting your views, and that's another area where in Indigo that we'll be spending more time in the future as well in terms of helping people to kind of go from the designs they've discovered to jump starting the development process. Can Ignite UI work offline? Yes, it can, to the extent that you're not accessing data services. So as long as you don't need to do that, you're fine, but as I mentioned earlier, there are some ways to kind of deal with the partially connected scenarios. I have a very large Windows Forms app using data sets for database access. What is the best platform to move with the database layer with Angular in mind? I would suggest that you look at Entity Framework, honestly. You can't use your data sets, as far as I know, with that, but it's in terms of rapidly getting your data exposed in a way that can be used in the modern web. That's probably the easiest approach. And lastly, can you briefly touch on two-way data binding? Yes, two-way data binding is supported in our controls, but specifically also in Angular. You can do that with their data binding, and I think pretty sure Knockout does the same thing. In terms of how you get the server, involved in that, you have options. You can do individual callbacks that would post back to the server as they update, like for instance, individual rows, or you can do batches. So it's kind of up to you and what makes sense for your application. But it should, in most of those cases, you're dealing with a JavaScript model. So you have the JavaScript objects and the data bindings happening between those and your view, and it definitely goes both ways. So that is all of our questions, and thanks everybody for listening in. And Jess.
Thanks, Ambrose. Thank you, Jason. So once again, we will be sending out a follow-up email with the recording of this presentation along with some links. So keep an eye out for that, and I want to thank everybody for joining us, and have a great day. Take care.
Have a good one.